Hey, zoology people. Today I'm going to go over the first part of the week's material. So today, the first thing I'm going to start off with is I'm going to call it Lecture 8, and this is going to be phylum Platyhelminthes and also phylum Rotifera. So without further ado, here we go. This slide deck is on your Lalima page. So let me share my screen. Shall get going. Okay, looks like you can see that. That is good. Okay, today we are kicking off like worms, and there's going to be a lot of worms. Today is some of the gnarlier worms, but we can one up that a little later on. So here we go. Got a new phylum to remember, and it's a whopper. Okay, so you are going to be memorizing how to spell phylum Platy. So Platy is kind of like a plate, and then Helminthes. Okay, I don't know how to tell you to remember that. So if we look at the basics of this phylum, we've advanced a little bit more from like our Cnidarian ctenophore guys, and now we actually have organ systems. We have organs and whole organ systems because we have real tissues. Okay. So for Platyhelminthians, they are going to be bilateral. I think that's the first time we've seen that so far. There's no segmentation. That's coming later. And for body cavities, again, we've got triploblastic organisms here. So they are going to be acoelomates. So the kind of the most basic of the animal coeloms. All right, now, if we talk about what is a platyhelminthian worm, so why did somebody put all of these things together, right? And they put them in one particular phylum. It's because essentially like they have some very basic features, even though these guys are a little bit different, by the way. If you just look at flatworm in general, that's what all of them are. And they have the ability to be quite mobile. They can actively move around, different again from like the cnidarians that we looked at before. They can look for shelter. They can look for actual habitat that suits them well, and they can actively go and find mates. So there's a little bit more advancement here, okay? And they have a little bit more body organization. Most of the time, radially symmetrical organisms don't have that same level of organization. And so bilateral guys have that. Now, there are two major evolutionary advances that come along with being a platyhelminthian. The first thing is that you have a head. If you recall, cnidarians and ctenophores didn't really even have like a head region. These guys do, and there's a fancy word for that. They call it cephalization, okay? So cephalization. So they have a head, and that just means that like around your head, it's kind of where you lead, and it's also where a lot of the sensory organs are. So consider that. Also, again, they have bilateral symmetry. First time you've seen it, and that is, if you just recall, the fact that you can divide yourself down the middle with pretty good mirror images on the side. So if you look at the top, these are all sorts of flatworms. You kind of get the gist. Most of the time when we say flat, like you can see through them. Like you could hold them up to light, and you can see their organs, and you can probably see the wall on the other side kind of idea. So these are very, very, very thin, like paperish thin kinds of organisms. If you look at, your radially symmetrical organisms, kind of like your jellyfish, they do have a few sensory organs that we talked about, but again, these things are concentrated in the head, which makes them different. If you look down at that diagram down at the bottom, you see these things called ocelli. They're called eye spots, similar to some of the statuses kind of idea that you saw in some of the cnidarians. Also, there's some really interesting bits here. If you look at the body plan of that flatworm down at the bottom right-hand side of your corner, you're also going to see that you see a pharynx, which also is kind of like around the mouth. That makes sense, right? You see a gastrovascular cavity, not like a true stomach. There's not like intestines. It's still just kind of a gut chamber, okay? And then you see just that one opening. And so just like the cnidarians, the mouth and the anus are really the same thing. You also see what they call a lateral nerve cord that also kind of joins throughout the medial section of these worms, and it makes a formation that we call a nerve ladder. So you'll see the term nerve ladder used quite a bit for platyhelminthian worms. Now, Again, we're diving into a giant world of worms. Half your battle here is going to be keeping track of which worms are which. And anytime you talk about what is a worm, we're just kind of lumping them into this group where like, okay, you're bilateral, even though it's hard to imagine sometimes that a worm is bilateral, and you don't have any appendages coming off that body. Therefore, you are worm. Therefore, you are also a term called vermiform. Okay, so vermiform just means something like a worm. So I think some of you saw that in the dichotomous keys. And yes, a lot of the worms, like in this cartoon, are parasitic. Not all, but a lot. Recall what an acoelomate is. Okay, acoelomates are organisms that have 3 germ layers, so they're triploblastic, but they do not have any type of gut cavity. So they're solid through and through. And that means that their organs are embedded in the mesoderm. So if you look at that, we're calling it parenchyma. It's just the mesoderm, derived from the mesoderm. And the gut is also therefore embedded in that with the ectoderm surrounding it. There are at least 4 different phyla in the animal kingdom that have this gut structure. The only one that we are going to go over is phylum Platyhelminthes, but I put the other 3 there, and literally, guys, that is just like an FYI kind of moment. I don't even know that I know what all of those are. All right, now you're also, as we start this group of animals that are bilateral, right? And they've got now triploblastic tissue layers and all of this stuff. We also get into another clade, because you can tell that there's a big evolutionary advancement here, right? So the clade that we are in is a mouthful, but it's called Lophotrochozoa. Okay, so Lophotrochozoa. So Lophotrochozoans are organisms that have 2 things. So they kind of smashed it together in this word. They have a lophophore, which is that feathery thing that if you look at the GIF down there at the bottom, that's what you see kind of unfolding. That's a feeding mechanism. Sometimes they can also use it for a little bit of respiratory, surface kind of idea. And then they also have this thing called a trochophore larvae. So trochophore larvae, look at the diagram, you'll see this a lot, and you see it throughout like some of the bigger groups even. I think it goes well into some of the throughout the protostomes, this trochophore larvae idea. So all of these animals I think are related in some way because their larvae all kind of looks like that. See that band of cilia and then an apical tuft of cilia, and they have a little anus down there, like the whole thing. Okay, so that is larvae swimming around in some sort of aquatic environment, and then it will recruit and become the adult. So the lophophores typically will also develop as the adult. So that's just kind of like a tie that binds, and you'll see that throughout. Now you can also see Lophotrochozoa up here at the top. You can see that we've got lots of different groups that fall within, and this is just part of Lophotrochozoa. You got the Platyhelminthians, the gastricans. You've got a couple that, again, we're not going to go over, including this one. We'll hit the rotifers here, but those, again, are all Lophotrochozoans. So I'll show you how they are similar and, of course, how they are different. All right, let's start off with phylum Platyhelminthes. So if I were writing this on the board, I would stop and I'd be like, okay, everybody write down phylum Platyhelminthes. And I'd be like, what are those? And then you would write next to that, these are flatworms, okay? So, all right, what are flatworms? So then the next bit would be to write down all their characteristics. So their characteristics would again be they are triploblastic, they're bilateral, they have an acoelomate body cavity, and then some of them have those sensory organs around the head, so they have cephalization. Some of them have a nerve ladder, but there are some rule breakers within this group, so I'll point those out as we go along the way. A lot of these are parasitic, but some are free living, like that little planarian worm. See the one kind of buzzing across the top? So those are free living, and those are, again, free living flatworms. There's not one single feature, however, to learn for all of Platyhelminthes. So I'll just tell you to put that they're acials, that they are typically flat and paper thin. They do have some sort of cephalization, but again, this is kind of a big group here, and this is a little bit weird. So these are some examples. See those ribbon-like animals? And some people might look at that and think they're sea slugs, because they get mistaken for sea slugs a lot, but see how paper thin they are? So those are the free-living ones. And then, of course, there are others that are parasitic. So have you guys ever seen your dog or your cat do that? Sometimes it might be their anal glands. Other times it's because they got worms, and you can see those little segments of rice that come out of their butts. That is a flatworm. And so we'll talk about how tapeworms are platyhelminthian worms here coming up. All right, so you've got different classes, right? So again, if I were in class, I would stop and I would write this on the board. So I'd be like phylum Platyhelminthes, and then here are the classes that I want you to know, the divisions really within the flatworm. So the first one that I would write on the board is class Turbularia. Turbularians are like not the gross ones. Turbularians are some of those pretty ones that you saw swimming around. And so there are all of the free, if you're going to be free living, you've got to be in this group. There are a couple of things that are qualifying as commensals, and there are a couple other things that are qualifying as maybe on parasites or on the border of being a parasite. But if you're going to be one of the pretty free living ones, you got to be in this class, and that's the general rule. A lot of them are aquatic. There are a few that are terrestrial, and we have some of those here in Hawaii. Like this is one of the free living reef ones. This is called a fuchsia flatworm. You find them out at Richardson's, Onikaha. I've seen them I would say all the time, but they are typically not any bigger than like the size of your thumb, and oftentimes like half that. They're pretty small, but they are bright fuchsia pink kind of thing. Now, there are 3 classes that contain only parasitic species. So these are all parasites in some way, shape, or form. So there is class Trematoda. Notice the spelling, Trematoda. These are what you call flukes or endoparasitic. Endo means inside your body. So endoparasitic flukes. Then there's a newer one that I didn't learn when I was in school, but this is a legit separation. They call these the monogenea, class monogenea, or the monogeneans. These are ectoparasitic. So if you hear the word ecto, that means on the outside, like a tick is an outside parasite, like an ectoparasite. This is an ectoparasitic fluke. They have a pretty interesting host. And then there are the cestodes. So class Cestoda. These are endoparasitic, so inside your body, and they are tapeworms. Okay, so those are the 4 classes. One is free living, and if they're free living ones goes in Turbularia. Everything else is a parasite, either inside your body or outside your body. Now, this lovely fellow right here, that is a fluke, an endoparasitic fluke. I believe that's a liver fluke. They attach, guess what, to what organ? And then this is one of the new ones. This is a monogenean. So these are ectoparasitic, and they tend to attach to fish gills, which is pretty interesting. And you can see that head region looks very different than the fluke. So that's why they separated them out. And then those are tapeworms. So tapeworms, they are genuinely disgusting. But organism itself is kind of interesting, I have to admit. So we'll go over the tapeworms and all of the other gross parasites. All right, so again, there's not one tie that binds Platyhelminthians, but here are some of the kind of like bigger key features, like if you're going to start to list them. So what are the things that I would like for you to be able to look at, especially we tend to kind of look at the planarian worms, the flatworms, the turbularians, because they're not parasitic, and we tend to kind of go with those. So here's the idea. Most of them have a mouth and a pharynx, and that pharynx can actually like eject out of the body a little bit, like extend out of the body. Do you guys see this lower diagram down here, right here? See how the pharynx kind of moves out like a straw, and they can inject some of their money, they can inject some of their food that way. I don't know where that came from. They also have some sort of gastrovascular cavity and an intestinal-like kind of structure in there. You can see inside of here, that's where the pharynx is going. here's a picture of the intestines. This is part of the gastrovascular gut that you can see right there. Okay. Tapeworms are the exception to this rule. They don't have a digestive system at all, and their nutrients just get absorbed directly over their body wall. Now, most flatworms are going to osmoregulate. So if you remember, that is the balance of water versus salt kind of idea, as water moves in or moves out of their bodies, but they do it with something fairly unique called flame cells. So up here, you can see this flame cell idea. So it's got these little beating flagella. See the flagella? It's got little beating flagella, and it drives the water through these little tubules right here. See all of those? And then out the pores. And as it does that, again, it's either taking salt in, putting salt back out kind of idea, regulating the water within the organism so it doesn't swell or it doesn't have some sort of beef jerky moment. So those flame cells are found throughout the body. See, they're right here. And they are, again, an osmoregulatory thing. So it's fairly unique to this group and it is worth noting. The other thing that they've all got is a nerve ladder. Okay, so a nerve ladder, why is it called a nerve ladder? Because you can kind of see the nerves extending. Here's the transverse nerves right here. And then you can see like these lateral nerve cords that run along the body. And then the nerves cross over like this. So it kind of looks like a ladder. And so they do have, like you have a spinal cord that is dorsal and hollow. They have lateral solid nerve cords. Now, those things are also attached to some sort of, not an eyeball, but an eye, like light sensory kind of thing. And they kind of look like little eyes. We call them eye spots. But again, the proper term is going to be the ocelli. They do have statocysts, and those statocysts are used pretty much the same way that you see in the cnidarians for some sort of equilibrium, kind of like their balance kind of idea. They also have these little ear-shaped flappy dudes on the head type region. See this right here and that right here? These are called the auricles, and we think that they are for a lot of kind of sensory, like as they're moving through, they can kind of chemical sense, like taste, if you will, smell, if you will, kind of that kind of realm. They can also just feel their way through surfaces because they're leading again with that actual head. All right, so those are some of the body features. Now, when they go to reproduce, they are multi-talented. Okay, so when they go to reproduce, they can be sexual in their reproduction, and they can also be asexual in their reproduction. So a lot of the times these guys are, well, they're kind of known for their asexual reproduction, especially if you are one of the turbularians. This is a experiment used to run in every biology lab ever, where you would take a live planarian worm and you could see how many bits you could chop it into. Like, can you chop the head off? Can you cut it right in half? Can you make chunks out of it? And then how many of those would regenerate into a complete organism? So if you start off with one, and then you can cut it, and that particular, those three pieces will make 1, 2, 3 organisms, that is called fission. And it's a regenerative form of asexual reproduction, but you can take one body and just generate more bodies with it. And therefore it is considered asexual reproduction because it's certainly not egg and sperm. Now, there are some that can reproduce sexually, and those are monoecious, which means that they are male and female all in the same body, and they can cross-fertilize, which again is a little unusual because that's, kind of a weird inbreeding kind of thing. They also have one of the weirdest types of sexual reproduction. Hold on, I've got to go over and I'm going to say share the sound because I do want you to, I'm going to mute my mic and I'm going to play this little video. And if you've read the title already, I think you can probably, get an idea of how exciting this is going to be. Okay, I'm going to mute my mic and I'm going to play this little.
Flatworms have both male and female sex organs. But when it comes time to make little flatworms, they have to decide who plays which role. And that they fight over. The two flatworms rear up, exposing their midsections. Those jutting white nibs aren't weapons, at least not intentional ones. They are actually the worm's penises, a double-barreled inseminator, if they can shoot first. Flatworm sex consists of the two attempting to stab their lover with their pointed pair and inseminate each other, an act delicately referred to as penis fencing. But there's nothing delicate about it. Flatworms have been known to gouge holes in each other in battles lasting up to an hour. Why do they cross swords? Producing offspring requires a lot of energy. The winning father can go out and about in the world without any further responsibility. The losing mother absorbs the winner's sperm. It must now work longer and harder to find food and stay alive. The father floats merrily along. The mother crawls along looking for a meal, already the responsible one.
Insert joke about the sexes here. Okay, they compete to see who has to be the mother because it takes so much energy. That is literally called penis fencing, and that is a legit term. Can't make this stuff up. Okay, penis fencing. Okay, now here's the first class, class Turbularia. Okay, now there are a couple of different kinds of turbularians. They tend to lump them into something called triclad and polyclad. I used to always hear them just be referred to, oh, these are the polyclad flatworms. But some of them, again, are not polyclad. There are triclad as well. The triclad ones include the planaria, which we've kind of been looking at here a little bit on and off. And then these guys up here at the top, have you guys ever seen these in Hilo or anywhere, I guess, on the Big Island? I've seen them. They have these big, like, arrow-shaped heads. I think they call them arrowhead worms, but don't quote me on that. I think that's what they call them. And they are terrestrial. You can see it's like crawling on a sidewalk. I've seen it. Somebody told me they were crawling out of their shower drain. They're very long. Now, they're triclad, these guys, because they have a three-branched intestine. The polyclad turbularians have a simple gut or no gut, okay? And they have this folded pharynx and gut with many, 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 many branches. So if you look at the polyclad versus the triclad, you can see the many, many, many branches, so many clad, okay, of the intestinal bits. So very simple. Again, we're just talking about a pharynx and an opening, but the intestines will kind of like these little branches that come off. They're kind of like intestines. Will come off and branch to more places within the body. Okay, so that's class Turbularia. These can be the free living guys, can be, not all of them are though. And they can either be triclad or polyclad flatworms, Turbularians. Okay, now here's gross. This is class Trematoda. Okay, trematode. Now, trematodes are all endoparasites, so inside your body, of vertebrates, so things with backbones. And we call these flukes. Okay, so if you look up at that photo, if you dare, at the top left hand, like see those big pancake looking things? Those are flukes, okay? And those are flukes on something's liver. And so a lot of wild animals carry a huge, parasitic load, and this is one of them. But there can be all sorts of different kinds of flukes. Like I used to do marine mammal stranding, and there was a little dolphin that came in, like a neonate, And she had brain flukes, she had lung flukes, like there were flukes everywhere in this poor thing. And so they're really great parasites, and they'll just attach to different organs inside of a vertebrate. No joke. Now, if you look at the body, if you look at the anatomy of these guys, it's kind of interesting and kind of gross, but it all kind of is. They have these things called penetration glands that helps them bore in to the organ. They have glands to produce a cyst material, so they can just, hang out in there forever. If your immune system starts to attack them, they'll just insist and live there. And then they've got hooks and suckers for adhesion. So if you look right here, here is an oral sucker, okay? And that is, again, so they can attach, like these guys right here are completely attached to that internal organ. Really gross. And because they are great parasites, endoparasites, they can produce babies like nobody's business. They can produce huge numbers of offspring, and they can just keep going and going and going inside an organism's body. Now, I won't tell you what part of the South I was in, but I remember sitting in class and talking about flukes and talking about liver flukes. And one of the folks in class said, "Oh yeah, that's what we get when we go hunting deer. And if you get some," he called them something like, it's something like pancakes. And I looked it up, and they call them liver butterflies or little flapjacks. And seriously, he's told me his whole story, how you peel those things off the liver and you bread them up and fry them up, and they're the tastiest things ever. I can't make this up. And I looked it up, and it exists. Like, that is a thing. I do not recommend this for any reason, but that does happen. Okay. Now, there are also a lot of flukes that don't just deal with things like wild animals. Okay, there are a lot of flukes that can infect humans. Okay, and one of them is aptly named the human liver fluke. Okay, it's clonorchis cyanesis. Okay, and so sciences. And that is a very, very complex life cycle that these things go through. They need intermediate hosts in order to complete the life cycle. So if they don't have some of these hosts, they actually cannot survive. And so they need intermediate hosts. Now, if you followed along with this, you see that the first host has to be a mollusk. Okay, so like, guys, here's a snail. If you want one more reason, like, you should not be like handling things that have had snails or slugs or something on them. This is yet another one. The final host, a definitive host is what they call that, has to be a vertebrate. And that is because the organisms reproduce sexually in the final definitive host. And that's where people come in. A second or third intermediate, depending on what type of organism you're talking about, what species you're talking about, might actually be required as well. Now, a lot of times these will occur in like cats, dogs, pigs, that kind of thing. But this is one species that tends to target humans. And if you get enough of these in your body, they will completely take over your liver and cause psoriasis, and you can die. So if you look at the life cycle, okay, essentially you've got these adult flukes that live in the liver, and then they reproduce sexually, okay? And the sexual reproduction bit, okay, is where you have this fertilized egg that comes out, and then the fertilized egg comes out, and that has to be eaten, like has to be eaten by a snail. And I'm sure it's not every kind of snail out there, but it's only certain kinds of snails. And then it will start to develop, and then it enters this intermediate stage called a cercaria. And then that has to be eaten by a fish. And then the fish eats it, and then it insists in the fish's muscle. And then that's where you come in, okay? And then you eat the fish. And if it's not cooked to the point where you killed all those cysts, then you shall get the the trematode, the trematode, and it will hatch out in your gut and migrate to your liver and complete its life cycle. And at the same time, you'll have many, many of these flukes potentially living inside your body. Again, it can be fatal depending on how heavy the infection is. All right. Class monogenea. So the next class monogenea, and you can put over here, I think I see them referred to as monogeneans, but you can also call these, I think it's okay to probably call these fish gill flukes, even though some of them do occupy the bladders, weird, of frogs and turtles, which again is just bizarre. But most of them are external parasites of fish, okay? And that is one of the reasons they got set aside. Now, they also got set aside out of the other flukes because of this thing. So do you see this word, apisthophore? Apisthophore. That is a specialized head, okay? It's like an attachment. It's got awesome hooks. See all the hooks all over it? And that's how it attaches to its host. They have a direct life cycle and only a single host. And that's another reason that they took it out of Trematoda, because there's no, they don't need intermediate hosts, like multiple hosts to complete a life cycle kind of thing. They can one and done in these ectoparasites. These are probably more widespread and common than we understand. And again, you find them mainly on the gills of fish. Can you see that up there? And then you also see that they can occupy different types of frogs and types of bladders. Now, frog bladders. As they looked at them more and more, they realized that definitely weren't trematodes. And potentially they were even more like the cestodes, which are the tapeworms that we'll see next. But here's what I want you to really kind of focus in on is this apisthophore thing, which is the specialized head. And again, single host, all of those kind of things are good characteristics to remember with the monogeneans. Now, here's the grossest of the gross. This is class Cestoda. So class Cestoda are tapeworms. If you've ever seen one, again, if you had a dog or a cat and you see those little weird wiggly things come out of their anus, that's a tapeworm. And always be careful with those because you can transfer those to humans out of your cat and dog. Tapeworms break a lot of the rules here because they don't have the pharynx, the mouth. They don't have the gastrovascular cavity. They don't have any, or like no branching, intestine-like things. And it is mainly because they are such good internal parasites that maybe they've lost those kind of features over evolutionary time. And once they get inside of your body, they will attach usually to like the small intestine. Like in humans, you're going to see them in the upper portion of the small intestine, probably like the jejunum kind of area. And they will take this head, the cephalized part of their body that is called a scolex. I will ask you about scolexes because again, I think they're fascinating, but this looks right out of a science fiction movie. If you look down here, this is an electron microscopy image of a scolex of a tapeworm. And so class Cestoda are all tapeworms. Tapeworms have scolexes that have hooks. You can see the hooks and suckers. And they use that to anchor into the tissue of the inside where your food goes, small intestine. And then here's the crazy thing. They lack a digestive system. And so as you eat food and your stomach processes the food down in tiny molecular bits and it puts it into the small intestine, which is where all of your nutrients are absorbed, that's where they live. And so as the food comes out into the small intestine, they just rapidly absorb it right over their body, like right over their epithelium, and rapidly absorbs into their body faster than your intestines can do it. And so like if you've ever had a puppy that had tapeworms, they might look really emaciated with really bloated stomachs. And a lot of that is because you might be feeding them. But the tapeworms you were actually feeding the tapeworms more than you were feeding the puppy. Now they're also insane reproducers. And I want you to remember this word, just it'll just haunt you if nothing else, the proglottids. Okay. So do you see this worm? So right here, you've got a scolex up here at the top, and then you see all of that down there. Essentially, guys, that is all proglottids. Now, the ones up at the top are immature proglottids, and the one down at the bottom are what we consider gravid proglottids. The proglottids are the reproductive structures. So it is an eating, reproducing, nothing else machine. They have no like sensory organs. They're just, because all they got to do is hold, it's dark in there anyway, right? And so all you got to do is hold on to the inside of your intestines and eat and make babies. And so these will break off as they mature, and then they will exit with the waste of the digestive system, AKA out your butt. And so that is why when you see those little wiggly wormy-like things coming out of an animal's anus, hopefully never yours, those are highly, let's call it contagious, because at that point, if you come in contact with those and they get into your digestive system, they will hatch out and they will make more tapeworms. So abundance of caution, okay, if you have any exposure. That is what it looks like, by the way. If it gets into your intestine, I'm pretty sure that's a human intestine. And so these guys can be long, really long and really gnarly. And you can get rid of them. It's not that hard to get rid of them. If you're giving it to your cats or dogs, they have this medicine called Cestex, like CEST and then EX, Cestex. And it is like a poison-ish kind of thing that the animal takes it and it kind of just puts these guys to sleep. And then they let go with the scolex and then they can pass out through the stool. But again, they're still not dead. They're alive. They could be infectious. You got to be really careful if you ever do that. So for tapeworms and pets, like it's also really important to understand how they get them. So animals have to be bitten by fleas that are carrying the larvae. So if you look at this diagram, like number one, like flea jumps on cat, right? Cat starts grooming. Cat eats the flea as it's grooming. And then the larvae are inside of this flea. And then once they are in the cat's digestive tract, then they will mature. And as they mature, they will start to form the adult worm with the scolex and the proglottids and all of that stuff. And then you've got these proglottids inside there, okay, that are fertilized. Egg and sperm come together and they fertilize. And then the end segments release and they get excreted with the poop or just come on out. And then they are in the grass or in the soil or wherever it might be. And that is where the fleas come into contact with them. And then the whole cycle starts over and over and over again. Now, there are a lot of tapeworms out there. And again, this is a pretty normal thing that most vertebrates carry. They carry a tapeworm load, like fish can get them. Farm animals, of course, can get them. All sorts of wild animals can get them. There are 4,000 different tapeworms out there. They've evolved to do quite well for themselves. A lot of them don't do significant damage. Some of them, if it like an animal is weakened, it'll cause a lot of nutritional problems. But they just kind of get, sick, emaciated, bloated. I'm sure it doesn't feel very good. And again, humans can get these. Oh, there are all sorts of stories out there. All right, we're switching gears. But worm, not exactly worm, kind of worm-like, I think. We're going to look at phylum Rotifera. Okay, now phylum Rotifera is what we consider a pseudocoel. Now there are only really a couple pseudocoels out there. It's not very common. And so we'll talk about these guys. But the pseudocoels in question here, just recall what it is. You've got an actual coelom gut cavity kind of thing, but it's not completely lined with mesoderm or muscle. So the actual gut itself does not have the lining, does not have the muscle that is lined by mesoderm, but it's still a fluid-filled cavity, okay? And these are little rotifers. So phylum Rotifera, you've got, everybody's triploblastic, you've got organ systems here, bilateral, there's no segmentation, and again, the body cavity is pseudocoel, so a pseudocoelomate. Now, here's what they look like. Some last semester, we were looking at these under the microscope, and one of the students said they looked like little worms with chainsaws on their heads under the microscope. And I was like, what? And now when you look at this like little GIF, you're like, oh yeah, I see the chainsaws. Now, the chainsaws are called the corona, okay, which is where they get their name. And so a ciliated crown is what that means, a corona, and it beats like a rotating wheel. And they use this to kind of acquire their food, to drive water and therefore small bits of food into their mouth. They're, completely aquatic. Most of them just live down on the ground. There are about 2,000 species of these things, and the body is actually kind of complex. Like you have a mouth in the middle of the corona, food goes in there, okay? Here are these things called flame bulbs. They also have this mouth part called a mastax. It's kind of for grinding and chewing the food. You can also see little eye spots there, so like little ocelli. You do have things like salivary glands. You've got a true stomach. You've got intestines, and you've got like a little cloacal bladder, and the anus is right here. You also have this whole little projection thing down here that they will call a foot with 2 toes at the bottom. And that is a pretty defining feature of their body plan. So phylum Rotifera. We're not going to do any classes for this one, just the phylum. So phylum Rotifera, these are called rotifers. They have a corona, they have a mastax, okay, and they have a foot with toes. Their body itself has a head, that area, a trunk, and a foot, okay? And the foot, again, can have anywhere from 1 to 4 toes, depending on the species, depending on the group, and some of them can retract. They will have these things down within this foot area called pedal glands that can help them kind of stick to things, so they can kind of hold on, like think about like algae or some little plant or some other, like a little rock or debris, and they can hold on, and then they can kind of spin their corona and draw food within their mouth. So the corona is a pair of ciliated discs. These beating cilia, again, help for feeding, kind of help move them around when they're not attached to something. And then the mastax. The mastax are like these hard jaws that as food comes in through the mouth from the beating corona, you see those mastax right there, and they're kind of it's like chewing kind of thing, and they'll break it down and send it into the stomach for digestion. They also have something called a cloacal bladder. It's not like our bladder, it's not like kidneys are attached to it or anything, but that is where some of the waste products from digestion will go, and some of the things that therefore need to be excreted from the body. It does have a brain, okay? So there is what we consider a bilobed brain. You can see the eye spots on either side, like one on each lobe. So you are getting into a little bit more developed nervous system here. Now, ecologically, like these are microscopic organisms, okay? But ecologically, they are really important, mostly to freshwater environments. They have one of the highest reproductive rates among any of the metazoans. Remember, those are the multicellular animal type deals. And they have some of the highest population density in the shortest amount of times. They are reproducing machines. Now, why do we care? Because these are really important zooplankton. So they act as a way to go from like the bacteria level, the phytoplankton level, the things that are the primary producers, and then they eat those. They bring that energy, therefore, up the food chain, and then there are a whole slew of things that feed on them. So they are important links to from the primary producers, which again, we can't have ecosystems without those, to the rest of the food chain. And so they're found everywhere. Now, when I say aquatic and freshwater, guys, this could also mean like films of water in like a glorified puddle or just kind of moist soil. So they're anywhere, but there is some sort of moisture. Now, they are fine in rivers and streams and lakes, but again, sometimes it's just a film of water somewhere, and they can grow there. So in that film of water, they will hang out on moss, like the bryophytes. They'll hang out on lichens. Okay, so those are that combo organism. Tree trunks, rocks, again, mushroom, anything that forms a little pool or holds any type of water. They've even found them in the tanks of sewage treatment plants, all sorts of places. So these are very, very, very prolific organisms. And again, even though you look at them, you're like, well, that's maybe not very exciting. They're very important ecologically to the rest of the food chain. All right. Tried to get that one done fairly quickly. That's part one. And then you will have a part two posted shortly. All right, I am going to stop recording and stand by for the second YouTube video.